Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Brian from Kingdom Hearts and Cross Nation. And today we're going to be going over the Scrooge McDuck medal that we got for the DuckTales medal banner that we have going on. Now don't worry, I know a lot of you are really expecting that Master Xehanort medal analysis video. And I'm kind of saving that for last on purpose, partially because of the fact it's like, you know, best for last type of thing. But it's also partially because of the fact that we will be getting Master Xehanort for what, 7 weeks, whereas the DuckTales medals banner ends in only a few more days. So, at least the way I see it, it's a lot better to have the Scrooge McDuck analysis come out first, and then have the Master Xehanort medal analysis come out tomorrow. But yeah, anyways, just like usual, I have the medal already updated on my site, like you can see here on my screen. Just go to khuxnation.com. And I will have it up here on my main homepage. Now, if you're watching this from the future, it's not going to be there. But you can still access the article by clicking on the link in the description below if you want to go ahead and check that out. But without further ado, let's get started on this medal analysis. Looking at Scrooge McDuck. Scrooge McDuck is a magic upright medal, tier 7, single target, has a max multiplier of 1.67, uses 0 gauges, and this is what he does. For 1 turn, he raises strength and PSM strength by 7 tiers, lowers target's defense and PSM defense by 7 tiers, and enemy countdown is added 5, and refills 7 gauges. There's a bit to say, quite a bit to say when it comes to this medal. Because obviously the largest thing about this medal is its comparison to Illustrated Kairi X that we have right now. At the very least for those of you that have it. For those of you that don't have Kairi X, obviously this is like the medal that you want right now, especially because of the fact that the DuckTales banner is only 1,500 jewels. So it's like one of the, it's like one of the cheapest banners that for this value that we've seen so far in a long time. This is literally the alternative to Kairi EX if you don't have her, to try and be at least somewhat competitive. But yeah, there's quite a lot of thoughts about this medal, and I actually had to end up rewording my analysis article, partially because of the fact that apparently at first it was worded in a way where the messages I was trying to convey weren't coming across clearly. So I ended up having to update and reword the article just a little bit, just to convey what I'm trying to say a little bit clearer. So if you happen to check that out beforehand, like immediately on release, go ahead and check it out again, just because of the fact that I've updated a little bit to make things clear, because this is one thing that I want to say at the very beginning of the video, just in case. But just to make sure, I just want to let you guys know that in no way whatsoever am I trying to say that Scrooge McDuck is ever better or as good as Kairi EX. Okay, that is not what I'm trying to convey at all throughout this video. What I am trying to convey throughout this video is that Scrooge McDuck is still a really good medal, and there will be times, aside from raid boss battles, there will be times where Scrooge McDuck could be seen as a possibly better medal to use at that moment instead of Kairi EX. Okay, but at the very least, Kairi EX will always be, and still is, the current default medal that you want to use in most given situations. Okay, Scrooge McDuck is simply just more of a situational and niche medal that you can use. But anyways, let me get more into this. So I'm going to kind of go through this video with 2 things in mind. The first one being if you don't have Kairi X, and the second one being if you do have Kairi X. Okay, simply because of the fact that that's what most people are concerned with, pretty much. So just to kind of help address the elephant in the room, we're going to start off with, if you have Kairi X, when would be times you would want to use this medal? I had to actually list this in my article too. It was like, this is probably one of the most lengthy articles I've had to write so far. It was like, Jesus. So essentially when it comes down to using this medal, it entirely depends on a few things. One, it depends on what medals you have. So like, do you have copy medals? If you don't really have copy medals, you're already in a bad spot regardless of what medals you have. The second thing is based on how far are you into the game at the moment. If you're at a position like I am, where you pretty much have everything completed at all times, and the only modes that you ever really kind of play with at the moment until they, like, you know, release new events like fill cups and whatnot. The only actual modes that you end up actually playing are like raid boss battles, Colosseum, and Union Cross when they get updated like every other week and so. So raid boss is the obvious one where like Scrooge McDuck is clearly just the better medal because of the fact that raid bosses are just one enemy and Scrooge McDuck is a single target medal, so it just makes sense to use Scrooge McDuck. Granted, you're not going to have the debuffs applied to the raid boss's limbs, but for the most part that should be okay because you're still getting the buffs received from Scrooge McDuck that can be applied to the AoE medals that are in the rest of your setup. And at the very least, the main body of the raid boss will have those debuffs, so when you're using those AoE attacks anyways, the main body of the raid boss is still going to be dealt max damage. So the Scrooge McDuck is just strictly the better medal to use when it comes to raid boss battles. So aside from raid boss battles, because that's just the easy one, let's talk about Union Cross. For Union Cross, it's kind of like a similar boat, because here's the thing. In Union Cross, most of the enemies in Union Cross are like weak as hell. Like they're just super weak that you honestly don't really care about having the debuffs from Scrooge McDuck being applied to every single enemy that's in the battle, okay? Because as soon as you use Scrooge McDuck, your buffs are already maxed out anyways, so you can pretty much go straight into using your damage medals from the rest of your setups from slots like 2 to 6 and stuff. And that alone should be able to help kill the enemies no problem. And obviously, the boss at the end of each mission in Union Cross, it's the same thing like for raid bosses. It's just one enemy, but even better, the bosses in Union Cross don't have limbs for you to worry about, so it's just like Scrooge McDuck just ends up being better in those situations as well. So now for the last one, for Colosseum. This is the one with the most controversy, and rightfully so, because of the fact that like people really want to try and use this medal if possible, but at the same time, the fact that it's single target kind of restricts it on its usage quite a lot. And here's the thing I would probably have to say when it comes to Colosseum and Scrooge McDuck. When it comes to Colosseum, Scrooge McDuck is a very situational medal to use in Colosseum. Most of the time, your chances are you're going to end up using the, you know, Kairi X if you have her. But sometimes during certain stages of Colosseum and like Colosseum changes every single month, so it can be very easily possible that there will be some stages where Scrooge McDuck might be particularly more useful. So now what type of stages would that be? Well, those would be kind of the type of situations where for each battle that you have within that stage in Colosseum, you're only fighting like 1 to 2 enemies per battle. And there's a couple reasons for that if it's not obvious already. The first one being that obviously if you're fighting just 1 enemy per battle, like, you know, sometimes there'll be stages where there's like only 2 enemies and they're like really high HP enemies. Like in those cases, hell yeah, you want to use Scrooge McDuck instead. or sometimes there'll be stages where like there's like 3 different enemies you have to confront. My bad, there's 3 battles in that stage, and for each battle there's like 2 enemies that you have to fight. Scrooge McDuck will also be arguably better for those type of battles as well. Okay, now here's the thing that comes to mind when people hear me say that or they think about that, okay? Which is the fact that the main thing that's enticing about Scrooge McDuck is that he maxes everything out in one go, okay? But if you have to end up copying him, it's essentially doing the same thing as Kairi X, so you might as well just use Kairi X instead. But here's the thing you want to like take into account when thinking about that, depending on what your situation is. When you copy Kairi X, yes, you will still have +4 upright buff total, just like you would for Scrooge McDuck. Your buffs will still be the exact same as you would for Scrooge McDuck. It's your debuffs, okay, that will only be just barely different, okay? Like, really barely different. Because of the fact that Kairi EX only applies a general defense down debuff of -3. So when you copy it once, you end up with a grand total of -6. And here's the thing about it in Colosseum. In Colosseum, once you start reaching the higher levels, like the tier 14, 15 spots and stuff, if you don't have -7 general defense down debuffs at all times, you're not going to be able to really do any damage to the enemies, period. And that's kind of where Scrooge McDuck kind of slightly comes into play when you're in those stages where you're only fighting like 1 or 2 enemies per battle in that stage. Because of the fact that Scrooge McDuck instantly maxes out all those buffs and debuffs immediately, you don't have to worry about, in your 3rd slot of whatever Keyblade you're using, you don't have to worry about that slot being used as a another. You don't have to worry about that slot being another general defense down debuff medal to help max out and cap out that debuff. And instead, if you really wanted to, which I would recommend, of course, which is where at that point you could finally actually just use your strongest damage medals in that slot instead. And you don't have to worry about the debuffs, is what I'm saying. But of course, if you end up facing 3 or more enemies at a time within any of the battles in a stage in Colosseum, you definitely want to use Kairi X instead. So kind of what I'm trying to say is, like, Scrooge McDuck is very effective against concentrated enemies. So like when you're fighting only 1 or 2 enemies at a time. But if you're ever fighting like a high mob of enemies, then yes, Kairi X is just strictly better. And like I said before, Kairi X is pretty much the go-to default medal that you want to use. Now, aside from Colosseum, there will be other like niche times that you would want to possibly use Scrooge McDuck. So both Scrooge McDuck and Kairi X refill gauges. However, Scrooge McDuck refills 7 gauges compared to Kairi X, who only refills 5 gauges. And sometimes, depending on whatever setup you may be using, especially with all the medals we've been receiving recently that have been that have been requiring 7 gauges to even use, you may end up in a situation for whatever reason where you might want that extra SP refilling for your setup compared to Kairi X. Okay. I don't know what setup you're running, but I'm just kind of throwing it out there that it's a possibility that could happen, okay? Whether or not it will for you or someone else, that's you, okay? I'm just simply saying that it's a possible thing. And the same thing is with your enemy countdown, okay? Scrooge McDuck actually adds +5 enemy countdown counters to enemies whenever that ends up being relevant. You mostly see it in events, but sometimes you see them in Colosseum too. Whereas Kairi X only adds 1 additional enemy counter to enemies. Alright, so now let's go into talking about whether or not how you want to use this medal if you don't have Kairi X, okay? If you don't have Kairi X, but you have Scrooge McDuck, you're essentially going to end up using Scrooge McDuck in the same manner that you would for Kairi X, okay? That's the easiest way to put it, okay? So let's say you're fighting multiple opponents. Easily what you can do is you put Scrooge McDuck in the 2nd slot, and then you have like HD Naminé, HD Shion, HD Anti-Form Sora, or something. Whatever, like any of those type of medals in the 1st slot, and then you have like a key art copy medal in the 3rd slot. So that way, Scrooge McDuck's ability ends up being used 3 times, so you can hit multiple opponents if you want. And that's not taking into account if any of your copy medals also happen to have extra attack. If any of them happen to have extra attack, that's just even more of a bonus for you, because that means you can now hit more opponents if needed. And then for the rest of your setup, because of the fact you already have max buffs and your opponents hopefully have max debuffs on them already, you can just have the rest of your setup just be pure damage medals. And that's essentially all you need to know when it comes to using this medal if you don't have Kairi X. So last but not least, we're going to cover Scrooge McDuck's score. I know I kind of didn't mention it beforehand. There's just so much to talk about for this medal that I kind of want to like go in order. Okay, so when it comes to Scrooge McDuck's score, Scrooge McDuck has a score of 102.487. So when I go over to my spreadsheet, like I have on my screen right now, it's already organized by score. We can actually see here Scrooge McDuck has the highest score in the game, and he's about like 20-ish points right above Illustrated Kairi and Shioni X. Now, for some of you, that might possibly come as a shock. To me, it was a little bit of a shock too. I was like, holy shit. But like legitimately it makes sense. Like, I'm not too surprised after thinking about it for a second. Because when you compare Scrooge McDuck and Illustrated Kairi X, when you compare them based purely off of their abilities, Scrooge McDuck is just strictly better. And when you consider their multipliers as well, Scrooge McDuck actually does have a slightly higher multiplier than Illustrated Kairi X, which is also a plus for Scrooge McDuck. Quite literally, and I mean literally, the only thing that is worse about Scrooge McDuck compared to Illustrated Kairi or Shioni X is the fact that he is a single target medal compared to Illustrated Kairi and Shioni X being AoE medals. That is legitimately the only thing that is worse about him compared to those medals. When you realize that, it makes complete sense why his score is that high. Like, he legitimately maxes out all buffs and debuffs, okay? I will state though, just as a kind of note, the only thing that Scrooge McDuck does not do that Kairi and Shioni X does do is the fact that Scrooge McDuck doesn't heal your HP like Kairi X does, okay? So if you need HP refilling, that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, other than that, that was it for today, guys. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that bell button. It's the best way to know when I upload a video, although that doesn't always happen, so hitting that bell button is the best way to know when I actually upload a video. And of course, I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this medal. I'm very curious what other people think about it as well. Yeah, other than that, that's it for today, guys. My name is Brian from Kingdom Hearts and Ucross Nation, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.